The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, 47 years late. The retired environmental activist sat in his Utah study, autumn light filtering through windows that overlooked the mountains he'd spent decades protecting. At 79, his hands shook slightly as he unfolded the yellowed paper. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the kind children used when they knew their words mattered. "Mr. Redford, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, but the promise you made to me at Bitter Creek still stands. The children are sick again. Someone must remember." It was signed Mary Crow Dog, age 8, Pine Ridge Reservation, 1976. The letter fell from trembling fingers. He had forgotten her face, but not her words, not the promise extracted beside a polluted stream where 7 children had died that terrible winter. But that had been a lifetime ago. Another man's war. The legendary filmmaker and activist had earned his rest. 3 decades of environmental battles had left him with a weak heart and doctors' warnings about stress. His foundation ran itself now. Younger hands carried the torch. At his age, getting involved meant risking the cardiac episode his physicians said was inevitable. Yet the letter demanded remembrance of that bitter February day in 1976 when he'd driven to Pine Ridge for what was supposed to be a simple documentary interview. He'd found children dying. The uranium mining company upstream had been dumping radioactive waste into Bitter Creek for 18 months. Federal regulators knew. Local officials knew. The mining company's own studies showed contamination levels that would poison the watershed for generations. But Pine Ridge was isolated, forgotten, politically irrelevant. The children died quietly, as Indian children had always died. 8-year-old Mary Crow Dog was the 7th victim when the famous actor arrived with his film crew. She lay in the reservation's small clinic, her dark hair falling out in clumps, radiation sickness ravaging her tiny body. The doctors said days, maybe hours, but Mary had been waiting for him. "You came," she whispered when he knelt beside her bed. "I heard children were sick." "They're all going to be sick now. The water's poisoned, but nobody listens to us." Her fevered eyes found his. "You're famous. People listen to famous people." He tried to explain the complexities, lawyers, regulations, jurisdictions, how these things took time. Mary's small hand had gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "Promise me something. Promise if more children get sick from the water, you'll remember us. Promise you won't let them say we don't matter." The promise had been easy to make to a dying child. Harder to keep when lawyers explained the legal impossibilities, when federal agencies cited regulatory limitations, when the mining company's settlement offers made problems disappear into sealed court records. Mary Crow Dog died 3 days later. The story never made national news. Now, 47 years later, her letter had somehow found him. The return address led him to her niece, Sarah Walking Bear, a tribal attorney who had spent 2 decades fighting the same battles her aunt had died from. "The mining resumed 5 years ago," Sarah explained over the phone, her voice carrying the same determined cadence he remembered in Mary's whispered words. "Different company, same result. 15 children in the past 18 months. Leukemia, kidney failure, birth defects." What do the authorities say? Same thing they said in 1976. The company has permits. The contamination levels are within acceptable limits. Her voice broke slightly. Acceptable for whom? At 79, with a pacemaker regulating his damaged heart and doctors monitoring his every movement, the smart choice was to write a check, make some calls, let others handle the complex litigation that environmental cases required. But Mary's letter sat on his desk like an accusation. Someone must remember. The morning he decided to return to Pine Ridge, his cardiologist called with test results. "Your heart is showing signs of strain. Dr. Martinez said gently. Any significant stress could trigger a major cardiac event. At your age, that would likely be fatal. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could die protecting children from poisons that had killed their parents a generation before. His assistant tried to dissuade him. His family pleaded. His lawyers outlined the legal exposure of getting personally involved rather than working through institutional channels. But the letter remained on his desk, Mary's careful handwriting, a bridge between promise and performance. Pine Ridge in autumn looked exactly as it had in 1976, wind-swept, impoverished, forgotten. The clinic was newer but just as overwhelmed. The cemetery had too many small graves with recent dates. Sarah Walking Bear met him at the tribal offices, her resemblance to Mary unmistakable. Same dark eyes, same fierce intelligence, same quiet desperation of someone fighting a system designed to ignore her. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure the letter would reach you. She kept it all these years. My aunt never stopped believing you'd keep your promise. When she died last year, she made me promise to send it if the water sickness came back. Sarah paused. It never really stopped coming back. The current case was both identical to and worse than 1976. Consolidated Mining, a different company with the same economics, had resumed operations with improved technology that still resulted in identical contamination. The legal framework remained the same. Permits granted, regulations technically followed, affected populations powerless to challenge federal approvals. But this time, there were internal documents. A young engineer named David Chen had been documenting the company's knowing violations for months. Risk assessments that treated Indian children's lives as acceptable losses, cost-benefit analyses weighing cleanup expenses against wrongful death settlements, email chains joking about the res problem. Why didn't he go public? The old activist asked. He tried. EPA wouldn't investigate without federal standing. Media won't cover reservation issues. Whistleblower protections don't apply to contract employees. Sarah's voice hardened. So children keep dying while bureaucrats cite jurisdictional limitations. That night, alone in his motel room, the aged environmental warrior felt the familiar rage that had sustained 40 years of battles. But his body betrayed him. His hands shook. His chest tightened. The medication that kept his heart beating made him dizzy and weak. At 79, righteous anger was a luxury his health couldn't afford. The next morning brought news that changed everything. 10-year-old Jamie Crow Dog, Mary's great-nephew, had been admitted to intensive care in Rapid City. Acute leukemia, advanced stage. The same disease that had killed his great-aunt. The old man drove to the hospital in silence, his pacemaker's steady rhythm the only sound in the rental car. Jamie was unconscious, his small body connected to machines that monitored functions too weak to sustain themselves. But his mother, Lisa Crow Dog, was waiting. You're him, she said simply, the movie star who made the promise. I should have done more back then. You were the only one who came, the only one who listened. She looked at her dying son. Aunt Mary used to tell stories about the famous man who held her hand and promised she mattered. Those stories kept our family believing someone cared. Sitting beside Jamie's bed, watching another Crow Dog child die from the same preventable disease that had killed Mary 47 years earlier, the old activist finally understood that some promises transcend the health of the promise maker. He called his lawyer from the hospital hallway. File everything. Federal court, state court, civil rights violations, environmental crimes. Use my name as plaintiff. Sir, Personal involvement at your age with your health condition, file it all. The lawsuit made national news within hours, not because reservation children were dying, that happened too often to qualify as news, but because a legendary figure had risked his reputation and health to honour a promise made to a dying 8-year-old girl nearly 50 years earlier. Consolidated Mining's response was swift and predictable. Character assassination, questions about mental competence, hints about the opportunism of aging celebrities seeking final glory. But David Chen's documents were devastating. Internal communications treating Indigenous children's deaths as acceptable business expenses. Risk analyses calculating that legal settlements would cost less than proper waste disposal. Executive bonuses tied to projects that knowingly poison children. The company's stock price collapsed within a week. 3 months later, Consolidated Mining agreed to a settlement that cleaned up Bitter Creek, established a medical fund for affected families, and created the strictest environmental monitoring system in federal history. Jamie Crow Dog survived. The experimental treatment funded by settlement money worked, but the legal victory came at a price the old warrior had expected. The stress of litigation, travel, and testimony had pushed his damaged heart beyond its limits. On a quiet December morning, sitting in his Utah study with Mary's letter still on his desk, he suffered the cardiac event his doctors had predicted. The funeral drew thousands: presidents, actors, environmentalists, indigenous leaders. But the eulogy that mattered most was delivered by a 10-year-old boy who had lived because an old man decided that promises matter more than personal safety. Mr. Redford kept his word to my great-great-aunt Mary, Jamie told the assembly, his voice clear and strong. He taught me that when you promise something to a dying person, that promise doesn't die with them. It lives in you until you make it real. The Bitter Creek cleanup was completed the following spring. The water runs clear now, as it had before. Corporate spreadsheets decided some children matter less than others. There's a small memorial beside the creek, marking the spot where Mary Crow Dog died in 1976, and where a famous man made a promise he kept 47 years later. The inscription, suggested by Jamie, reads simply, "Some promises are kept across generations." On summer days, when the wind carries the sound of children playing in water that will not poison them, visitors sometimes hear what sounds like whispered gratitude from voices too long silenced. The letter that arrived 47 years late had delivered its message. Someone had remembered. Someone had kept faith. In the end, that's all any of us can do. Honor the promises we make to dying children, especially when keeping them costs everything we have left. Some words, once given, belong to the future more than the present. Some debts must be paid, regardless of the price. The old warrior had learned in his final battle that the measure of a man's life isn't how many promises he makes, but how many he keeps when keeping them might kill him. Mary Crow Dog's letter had reminded him who he used to be. Keeping her promise had shown him who he was meant to remain until the end. In quiet moments, when conscience calls across decades and dying children ask for justice that may never come, the bravest answer is always the same. Yes, I promise, and I will remember. The water at Bitter Creek runs clean now, carrying with it the voices of children who lived because an old man understood that some promises are too sacred to break. The memorial stone stands as testament to what happens when fame meets responsibility, when wealth confronts conscience, when age chooses courage over comfort. Visitors often ask about the inscription. about the promise kept across generations. Local guides tell them about Mary Crow Dog, age 8, who died believing someone would remember. They tell them about Jamie Crow Dog, age 10, who lived because someone did. They tell them that the most important promises are the ones we make when no cameras are rolling, when no one will blame us for forgetting, when our own lives hang in the balance. The famous man who came to Pine Ridge twice, once as a young actor seeking a story, once as an old warrior keeping a promise, understood something that his generation knew, but younger ones sometimes forget. A person's word, given to a dying child, becomes the cornerstone of their character. Everything else, the fame, the fortune, the accolades, are just the decoration around that fundamental truth. The letter that arrived 47 years late had asked only that someone remember. In remembering, he had honoured not just Mary Crow Dog, but every child whose voice the world had chosen not to hear. And in the end, that remembering had made all the difference.